A little bit earlier today. Well, joining me now is Tom Harwood, senior reporter from the Right of Centre website Guido Fawkes, and Sienna Rogers, editor of the Labour List website, which focuses on news about the Labour Party. It's good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Tom, if I could start with you. We know what Number 10 has been saying about this whole situation and what certain members of the cabinet have been saying. The fact that members of the backbench are beginning to voice doubts about whether or not Mr. Cummings should stay in his post, does that give you pause for concern?
I think if we look at the specific MPs who've come forward and said that Dominic Cummings should go, if we asked those same people at any point over the last year whether Dominic Cummings should go about just about anything, they'd say yes. These are people who do have history with Dominic Cummings and who don't get along with Dominic Cummings, quite frankly. So I don't think it should surprise us that these specific few MPs have come out and said publicly that he should go. There's an intense media campaign against Cummings right now, and so that's almost to be expected. What is interesting, however, is that what those MPs are saying doesn't quite match up with a lot of the reporting. If we listen to what, for example, Steve Baker was saying this morning, when he was one of the first to come out and say that Dominic Cummings should go, he said that it was about the spirit of the rules rather than the letter of the rules, i.e. Dominic Cummings hadn't necessarily broken the letter of the rules. There is all of that fine print within the rules about specifically safeguarding children that Dominic Cummings seems to have abided by. So a lot of this is about how it looks rather than the legality of it.
OK, so you think there's a difference between the spirit and the letter of these lockdowns. Is that what Mr. Cummings might be able to explain to an NHS nurse who might be upset by his decision to drive halfway up the country with his wife next to him having coronavirus symptoms?
Of course, it's not a good look, and this isn't a PR victory for the government by any stretch. But what this is about Dominic Cummings doing what he felt was best for his family at the time. And of course, it's within the letter of the rules, and it's more complicated to explain the fine print of the rules than the broad overarching message. And of course, when you're explaining, you're losing. But that's not to say that he did something wrong. And I think there is a great degree of hypocrisy when it comes to this issue. Someone like Dominic Cummings, who it looks like stayed within the letter of the rules, if not the spirit, is having this intense media campaign against him, trying to get him to resign. And yet you look at, for example, the Welsh Health Secretary, a Labour politician, who explicitly broke the lockdown rules and faced no such intense media campaign to get him to resign. I think there's intense double standards within the media today, and that's something that we should be ashamed of, quite frankly.
Sienna Rogers, he didn't do anything wrong, according to Tom. There is the letter of the law and the spirit of these rules, and he was simply trying to protect his 4-year-old son. What do you make of that?
Well, I think obviously I'd have to disagree. I think the guidance actually was very unclear at the start. And then when the lockdown restrictions really came into force, it started to be much clearer, that government message. And they said, if you're symptomatic, stay at home. Take yourself out of society with your family and stay there at home unless there's an extreme risk to life. And I don't think we can say that in this situation there was an extreme risk to life. In nowhere in that government guidance did they say, well, if you're worried about childcare issues, then maybe you can travel 260 miles across the country in order to, just in case you need childcare, in case the other partner becomes ill with coronavirus symptoms as well, then you can do that. I mean, there just wasn't any of this coming out of the guidance at the time. It was very, very clear that you have to stay at home. And they even said, at your primary residence. So the fact that Grant Shapps this morning on the Sunday shows was saying, they weren't specific about what location you've got to be staying in when you're self-isolating is just nonsense, frankly. And I think it's the explanations, the very poor explanations afterwards, that are really going to do damage in this story, not the actual initial act of breaking the lockdown rules. It's the response of government ministers.
OK, Sienna, but I mean, Grant Shapps seemed to be quoting from the rules himself this morning when he said, if you're living with children, follow this advice to the best of your ability. However, we are aware that all these measures will not necessarily be possible. So there is wiggle room there, which is what Tom was suggesting a little earlier, that if you're concerned, deeply concerned about the welfare of a 4-year-old child, then perhaps you are allowed to make the kind of journey that Mr. Cummings made?
I think there's a few points there. I think, first of all, some of that wiggle room really applied to, in your own home, you should be self-isolating within one room and then isolating from the rest of your family in your home. I think that's how that was interpreted, that wiggle room, that obviously that's always not always going to be possible because you've got to take care of your children. And the other point is that actually, according to Dominic Cummings and his story and the statement that they've put out, they didn't need that childcare in the end. They just had a family member drop off some food shopping outside. It wasn't actually necessary in the end. You can't do these things as a kind of precaution. It didn't say anything about this in the government guidance. And I just really feel for all the people, all the parents, especially single parents, who made sacrifices, who were really worried about their situations. And they didn't know that they could go and, visit their parents and get the grandparents to look after the kids and all of that. That just wasn't an option that was given to them.
OK. Tom, if I could turn back to you. I mean, do you agree with Grant Shapps that the most important thing in this debacle, as it were, is that the Cummings family stayed locked down? They didn't move around. At no time did he return to Durham after the 19th of April.
Well, I think that is an important point because, of course, when we speak about some of the other high-profile discussions about people, whether they broke lockdown or not. For example, Kevin Jones, the Labour MP, went to a birthday party. That clearly is very different from a safeguarding issue to do with family. Again, no big furore. The Welsh Health Secretary, Labour politician, had a picnic with his family outside, explicitly ruled out in the Welsh guidance, and yet there was no enormous media intense furore.
Tom, let's just focus on Mr. Shapps, for instance. So you say that you believe that is the crucial point, that they stayed locked down. So the suggestion that Mr. Shapps made a second trip to, Mr. Cummings made a second trip to Durham on the 19th of April, and indeed he was seen at a tourist spot on the 12th of April, he's got to resign then, right? If those two facts are borne out, if those two suggestions are borne out, he's got to resign because he did not stay locked down.
I think that these two reports that came out subsequently from the earlier report are very flimsy. It's based on an anonymous source who thinks they saw someone who looks like Dominic Cummings. But crucially, the point here is that Dominic Cummings stayed locked down for the isolation period. And I understand he did come back down to London once that isolation period was over. So that seems to be the story. I'm not sure that there's much credible evidence that questions that story.
But if the evidence becomes available that is the case, and trust me, the Observer and the Mirror are sticking by their story, that's a game changer. He's got to go, right? He's got to go.
Look, I think that this doesn't help when we start jumping down people's throats, calling for scalps. This is not helpful in terms of the general political discourse. What is helpful is asking questions, not making demands. So yes, let's ask these questions. Let's approach this in a serious way. But let's not start trying to call for people's heads. That's not edifying. That's not how the media in this country should behave.
It's not the media that's saying this, Tom. It's members of the Tory party themselves that are saying this. Let's just turn to Sienna finally. Labour, interestingly, are not suggesting that Mr. Cummings' head should roll. They're saying there should be a full inquiry, which may actually exonerate him or find him guilty.
Yes, so Labour has taken this approach of basically, let's take a step back. And actually, first of all, we need a lot of questions answered about what happened here. When was the Prime Minister first made aware that Dominic Cummings was experiencing symptoms, that he travelled to Durham? We need to know a little bit more about that story of whether he was in that tourist spot, because it doesn't matter whether that was outside the 7-day or 14-day isolation period. He shouldn't have been there anyway. This is the height of lockdown restrictions. There are so many questions to be answered. And Keir Starmer has really taken the approach of, well, actually, there are Tory MPs calling for Dominic Cummings to go. Labour Party doesn't need to do that. It doesn't need to make this issue a party political one. It just needs a lot of questions answering at the moment. And let's hope that the Prime Minister does actually provide some of those answers and doesn't just say, well, we don't know the details yet, as Grant Shapps did this morning.
All right. OK. Sienna and Tom, it's good to see you both. Sienna Rogers there from Labour List and Tom Harwood from Guido Fawkes' website. Thanks to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, this week, the